and kick this off. We have Carla, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, and she'll introduce herself. And me, you may or may not have heard from me before, but I am Tisha Paredes, and my official title is Weed Knowledge Center Expert. I came from an institution, I left my institution in June, so I spent almost 2 decades there, and so I am here to talk with you about assessing gen ed. Like any good assessment people, we have some objectives for today. And so we'll really look at, we'll give you a quick overview. There's only so much we can do in about 50 minutes or so, but we'll talk a little bit about why assessing gen ed is hard to do within your institution. And really, we're doing that within a context of a case study kind of model. Well, Carla will share how she got people on board and maybe not everybody on board, but how she built the assessment process at Cameron. We'll also talk a little bit about pitfalls and challenges, and think about how to overcome those pitfalls and challenges. And then at the end, give you some ideas on how to start the process. So first thing we're going to do here is a little poll. So if you have your cell phone, you can pull it out and shoot the little camera, the little QR code, I don't know why I said QR code, and it'll come up on your cell phone. Or you can go to Slido, SLIDO.com, type in that number, and answer this question. What challenges do you face with assessing general education? Somebody beat me to the punch here and said everything. That is an answer, but maybe something a little bit more specific would be helpful. So I'll give you a few seconds. All right, and as you type in your responses and hit enter, they should come up on the screen. So getting faculty to participate, respond and participate. I think we all feel that. I think that's faculty buy-in. But if it's butt-in, that's okay. But I believe that's faculty buy-in. I too do not like texting on my phone. Relevant instruments, identifying courses, and they're going to come in pretty quickly. Leadership, faculty participation and leadership. A distribution of SLOs, scoring is different for courses, many different topics and subjects. Whew, you guys are typing out, you humans are typing out really, really quickly, consistency across sections and courses. That's really important here, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. Making changes incrementally, being consistent, and then where in the curriculum to assess. Very good. You can keep them coming. It is labor intensive, as you will see. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that for you. I don't think Carla will either. That is why we have the title of this presentation, Assessing Gen Ed is Hard to Do. It's not easy, and it will be a process, and it's an iterative process, and it's a process that takes time. So while we have tips and tricks, we don't have a magic bullet, but we at least have some ideas to help you get going. Lack of dedicated staff to support processes, really, really good there. Interesting artifacts from representative disciplines and so on. So good information here. For the most part, we'll talk about, I didn't read all of those, but we will touch on a lot of these, and getting faculty involved, getting some consistency across the curriculum. There are some hard choices that you're going to have to make too. So just keep that in mind as well as we talk about assessing gen ed. So first, why do we face these challenges? Why do we face all those challenges you talked about and you put in the Slido slide? Here it is. It's all about resistance, okay? People are resistant to change. People are resistant to getting involved in things. Maybe they've been around the university for a little bit. There's all different kinds of reasons. Here is not a comprehensive list, but a list of reasons why people might not get involved. And the reason I show this to you, because for me, it is very important to identify why people are resistant. Do they have a lack of trust? Is there a lack of ownership? Is there an insecurity? Maybe they don't know how to do it. if I can identify why people are resistant to assessing gen ed or to doing something, remember, it's just a change. We're asking them to do something that's out of the norm. Then I can hopefully hopefully I can think about some way to overcome that resistance. And so that is very, very important here. And we could do a whole nother hour on change strategies to overcome resistance, but you're really here to hear from Carla. And so she is going to share with you her journey to assessing gen ed at Cameron University. So Carla, it's all yours.
So thanks for everybody for joining us today, and thanks for inviting me to do this webinar. General education assessment is hard to do, and hopefully you'll get some ideas or some motivation to go back and work on general education assessment. So just a little bit of background. So my name is Carla Odie. I started out as a math faculty member. So I did assessment as math faculty member, then chair, then interim dean, and have been in my role, which is a really long title. I'm the Director of Institutional Research Assessment and Accountability since 2010. So that's a little bit from where I'm coming from. And then here's a little bit about Cameron University. So we're a regional public university. We're in Southwest Oklahoma. We are open admissions at the associate level. We have bachelor's degree and a minimum number of graduate professional programs. We just finalized our fall 2021 numbers this morning, so you guys have our fall 2020 numbers, but about 3,400 undergraduates, 300 graduate students. You can see we're fairly racially diverse. 50% of our students roughly identify as white and 50% identify as something else. And you can go to the next slide, Tisha. Just a little bit of background. So like all of you, you probably began your assessment activities at the program level many years ago, and we started in 1992-93. And then in 2008, 2009, we started our student services. Just as a little bit of a context, in academic year 2020-2021, we had all academic programs and all but 8 non-academic units. So we do have most all of our non-academic units also participate in the assessment process. We're not really going to talk about that today. We are going to talk about general education. And then like Tisha said, if you have any questions about anything that I'm talking about, or you want more clarification, please just go ahead and put that in the Q&A, and we will try to make sure we answer everybody's questions. All right, so yeah, next slide. So we have been blessed to be awarded the Excellence in Assessment twice. We applied for it in 2016, which was the first year that they did the Excellence in Assessment. We actually had a subcommittee of our Institutional Assessment Committee that wrote the application. I will tell you the hardest thing about the application was getting it under the word count. But it was a really interesting experience for us because it really made us stop and reflect about our assessment processes. I mean, a lot of times you're so busy doing them, you don't necessarily reflect on the big picture. We also got feedback as part of our application, and the assessment committee took that to heart. And it's a 5-year designation, so we applied again. And in 2021, we were awarded the Sustained Excellence in Assessment. And you can see the other institutions that have also received this designation. So if you have not looked at the Excellence in Assessment, I would suggest looking at it. They have a great rubric, and it can really help you find your strengths and weaknesses in your assessment program. And even if you don't get the designation, the feedback that you can get can really help with that assessment process. So a little plug for there. All right, so let me start out by saying that I truly believe this, that the purpose of assessment is to use data to identify strengths and weaknesses in student learning or engagement or satisfaction, and to make those changes to help increase learning satisfaction or engagement. And I say that all the time to faculty and staff and students. However, most of you are from accredited institutions, and you must also do it for accreditation. So we happen to be accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. And if you look at these 2 dates and these 2 bullets here, we had worked on general education and worked on general education, and in academic year 2008-2009, we started over. I was still department chair at this time. in terms of this. And you might not think that this is a coincidence that we started in 2008, 2009, and our visit was in 2010, right? So there was certainly some impetus to get us going back on general education. So like I said earlier, I actually took over this role in July of 2010, and our visit was in November 2010. So it was a very interesting time to transition into the Director of Assessment as we were getting ready for this. And I will say that although we got a great report from HLC, they did give us a lot of things for us to work on for general education because we were just getting started again. And so they recognized that, but they did give us a long list of items to work on, and we did. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that process. Right. So the first thing we had to do was start over with our SLOs. So our student learning outcomes. So ours had not been revised from something like 1983. So they were out of date. The language wasn't great. Some of them weren't measurable. And so that was one of the feedback. And you'll notice that we had our visit in fall of 2010 and we started in spring 2011. And so we were gonna redo our student learning outcomes. I cannot underemphasize how hard this process can be, right? Because people have been using these for a while. They either loved them or they hated them. And so we did a lot of focus groups, roundtables, discussions. We just let people talk. We invited people who were assessing these SLOs in their courses and, you know, had them talk about it. We actually hired a faculty member to lead some of the roundtable discussions for some of the more contentious ones to get input. And we actually did that in spring 2011 and fall 2011 and spring 2012. So that was a year and a half of just talking with different groups to try to get their input. Now we were actually working on the curriculum at the same time, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But we first needed to get the SLOs. So a subcommittee of general education in the summer of 2012, we met each week to revise the outcomes. So I sit on the general education committee as an ex officio member. They were the ones who did all the work, but I helped a lot with the logistics. And this perhaps sounds a little extreme, but the chair of the time pretty much locked the subcommittee into the room each week, and they had to have a revised outcome before he would let them go. So at that time we had 8 outcomes, and so we looked at NILOA, we looked at the value rubrics, we looked at our accreditors, we looked at all the focus groups, and they sat around a table once a week and wordsmithed and argued and came up with an outcome. So by the end of the summer, we had 8 outcomes. So Tish, if you want to go to the next one. And so then what we did in fall 2012, we sent a survey out to the faculty. So we said, here are our proposed student learning outcomes. You know, tell us if you like them, if you don't like them, do you have any feedback? We took all of that survey. The General Education Committee as a whole looked at then the survey results. There was a few tweaks to the language. It wasn't actually very major at that point in terms of it. And then we put that into, they submitted it to the academic officer for approval. And then we revised our general education. So as part of that process, we put our 8 student learning outcomes. It was sent to the Board of Regents. It was approved, and we started implementation in the summer of 2013. So if you think about that, we started spring 2011 and got them approved by summer 2013. So at least for our campus, it was a long process to change those SLOs. While we were doing this, we also totally redesigned the course offerings. So one of the things that HLC rightly pointed out is the way we were doing our assessment is a student could have, you know, gone through the cafeteria model and never have been taught something that was aligned with one of our student learning outcomes. And, you know, we say all of our students who graduate with a bachelor's or an AA or AS should have these skills and knowledge. So we had to redesign the course offerings so that regardless of what courses they picked, they were taught and assessed on all SLOs. And we had those conversations while we were having the roundtables and the focus groups having to do with the SLOs. We ended up with 8 student learning outcomes at that point and 12 disciplinary categories. So what I mean a disciplinary category, that means they can choose, one of these courses from this list, but they must take a course in that list. So we work to make sure that all courses in that disciplinary courses, they had to assess the same SLO, they had to use the same type of assessment measure, and they had to use the same rubric if it was a measure that needed to be used with a rubric. That was actually one of the suggestions that we had from our HLC peer reviewers, was we were doing totally different things in different courses, and there was no way to get a comprehensive view in terms of how our students were learning. And that was some of the comments that were put in the challenges, I think, that we saw there. And so it really was, if you want to be a general education course and you want to be in this disciplinary category, you must agree to use this type of assessment measure and rubric if applicable. The general education, met with department chairs, they talked about what was being taught in the course, what could and should be assessed, what type of assessment measure would give the best data. These could be some difficult decisions because you have some courses that have been in gen ed for a long time and then they don't align with any of the student learning outcomes. And so at that point, it becomes a conversation of, well, either you can't be a general education course or you can't be in that category, or, perhaps you need to change your content some so you are actually teaching this course. This content that aligns with the student learning outcome. And so again, that whole conversation was going on at the same time that we did the student learning outcomes, and then that whole package was what was submitted to the Board of Regents. So the next slide is going to show you just a snippet of what the curriculum map looks like. And there's a link there if you want to go look at the whole map. And Tisha put it in the chat. And so on the left, it's a little hard to read, but on the left are the courses that are in those disciplinary categories. So the state of Oklahoma does have a requirement for general education that we had to follow. And then our institution had some other ones. So every student must take a course in American history. And it's either for us history 1483 or 1493. Now this one wasn't so difficult, right? Because these are taught in the same department. And they decided that written communication was what they were most interested in assessing. So we let them teach other things, so they can teach about ethics or information literacy or whatever they want, but they must have something that they're going to assess. And so, for example, they decided to do a written communication. They do a 5-paragraph in-class writing assignment. They have a common rubric. Again, it's history 1483 and history 1493, pretty much the same faculty members. So that one they play well together. But if you look at the next one, we have a category called behavioral sciences, and these are actually in 2 different departments, so family science, psychology, and sociology. And we did have them have these conversations, and they decided ethics was what they wanted to assess. And they had 10 multiple choice questions. So they give them a scenario, and then they ask them what is the ethical choice based on the scenario. So we let them choose what that scenario is, right? So the General Education Committee does not get involved in the content. So the scenario, so they're different scenarios. So they are course specific scenarios. So what you're learning in psychology is a little bit different than what you're learning in sociology, but you still should be learning about the ethics of the situation. So they each have their own multiple choice questions, but they must have 10, and they work together to try to get them to be comparable. The other one I'm going to talk about just at the very bottom is the economics one, because you'll notice there are 4 classes in there, and that's actually 3 different departments that are teaching those courses. And so they all got together and wanted to decide which outcome they wanted to assess. Now, this one was a little bit different because economics is not required by the state of Oklahoma to be a general education course. And they did not want to be kicked out of general education because they wanted those student credit hours. So they were like, we're going to do 2. So they actually volunteered to have 2 outcomes at the time because they really wanted to show that they were important to general education. So they picked critical thinking and problem solving. So for the problem solving, they did work together to get their problems. They use the same rubric, but we don't get involved in the content. So the problems are different between agriculture, econ, and economic geography. But they did work together to have like an easier problem, a harder problem, and a harder problem, and the same types of problems. But again, the General Education Committee doesn't really get involved in what the actual problems are. So that's just a little bit of background of how we arranged our general education. And again, you can look at the whole map to see all of the courses at that link that Tisha put in. So just a couple more thoughts. So people wrote this in the chat that Tisha did at the very beginning. So it is the faculty who are teaching the general education. So they are the ones who are assessing the student learning. They are looking at the data. They are proposing and implementing changes based on the data. In some cases, it's, you know, course by course based. So maybe the students in sociology are doing really well on their 10 multiple choice questions, but psychology, they're really struggling with this one question. They're not getting this concept at all. So what is psychology going to do to try to help the students get that concept? So the faculty are involved in that. We have ended up with 4 general education coordinators. We didn't start out having 4 general education coordinators, but we've added them. So the ones that we have are for aesthetics, diversity, problem solving, physical sciences, and problem solving economics, because those were categories that had 3 or more departments. So like the econ one, we had ag, biology, and health sciences, business, and social sciences. And so the coordinators just help get the data from everybody, make sure that everybody's doing the assessment. They enter the information in Weave, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And they don't necessarily do the assessment unless they are teaching a course that's in the category. And they do receive 1 hour of service overload for this work that they get. The general education assessment process is overseen by the General Education Committee, and then my office does administrative help for them as well. So here's just a picture of what it looks like in Weave. So we decided to make it one project in Weave because we really wanted to emphasize that general education is a program, and you are not playing by yourself. You have to play with everybody else. And so we have one project. You can see the 9 outcomes. We had 8, and then communication, they decided to split up to written and oral. So that ended up in 9 outcomes. So we now have 9 outcomes. And then under each outcome are the different measures. So for example, under problem solving, I don't have a picture of it, but in problem solving, you have the measure from physical sciences, you have the measure from econ, you have the measure from math, and then we do have some indirect measures that we use as well. And we actually make them compile all the data in the findings. So you know your findings, if you're familiar with Weave, your findings is a small statement that just says, this many students out of this many students, you know, did what they were supposed to do. And we actually make them do that as a group. So all the math have to get together and do that, all the econ. And then the analysis of the findings is where they discuss about the courses. So let me pause for just a minute. So there was a couple questions that said, were departments able to create their own rubrics, or was there an agreement on those rubrics? If all of the courses were in your department, you got to create your own rubric. So math made their own rubric, history made their own rubric, because all the courses in those categories were in their ones. For the ones that were multiple departments, we had meetings where we sat down representatives from the departments and they came up with the rubric. So for the econ, I don't remember what summer it was, but we sat down one summer and had somebody from ag biology, health sciences, somebody from social sciences, somebody from business, and they came up with the rubric together. So they do have to use the same rubric. Same thing with the assessment measures. Like, so we all have to agree to use 10 multiple choice questions if we're in multiple disciplines. So I know the curriculum map isn't still up there, but if you only had one course and it was all in your department, right? So like communication, that was easy. They were all working together. And Comp 1 and Comp 2, which are the 2 English ones, they were all working together. It's the ones that were multiple departments that, yes, we did make them use all of the same rubrics. And that was quite the conversation. So let me just go to the next couple slides and then I'll see if I can answer some of the other questions. So we do want to make this a program, so it is a coordinated effort. So if you are going to make a change in an SLO or the type of measure or a rubric, we do have a process now that the proposed change must be approved by all department chairs and deans. Because again, we want them to play together in the disciplinary category. So music can't just decide to change, right? Because that would affect theater and art and other places that might be doing aesthetics. And so all the chairs and the deans must sign off on it. And then the change is sent to the General Education Committee and it is voted on by the General Education Committee. And then if approved by GEC, it is sent to the Vice President for final approval. She very rarely overturns. I don't think she's ever overturned a decision by the General Education Committee, but it is sent to her. And then just a little bit, we also have an institutional assessment committee and they do peer review the entries and they give feedback. And then we do have a discussion at least once every 3 years with the faculty to make sure everybody's on board, we're all doing what we're supposed to be doing, and to help them with their assessment process, right? Because this is difficult and you can run into a lot of issues that you hadn't thought about. So, no, Tisha, can you look at some of the questions and see if there's any that you think we should add?
Yeah, so there are a couple. We'll pause here before you get to your lessons learned. One of the ones that came up in the Q&A, and this might answer some other questions. How did you make faculty get together to put the data together and talk about the results? There's also a related question, you know, how did you get them together to analyze and really consider changes?
Yeah, so if it's within the department, a lot of that falls within the department chair. So for like the math courses, we think that the department chair should be the one. And in some of the departments, they have somebody who is in charge of their general education assessment. They may not get any release time for it, but it's part of their service. So the four, like I talked about, we had coordinators, and they are the ones that have to make sure that people are assessing, make sure that they're collecting the data. And we didn't have them to start out with, but you know, we quickly discovered that multi-department disciplinary categories needed some oversight to do that. How did we make them? Well, I started giving out chocolate to every single assessment meeting. Now, we used to actually meet in person, right? And I had a bag of chocolate, and every assessment meeting, they all got a piece of chocolate. Don't know that it affected it too much, but that was the best I could do because I really couldn't make anybody do anything in my role. But you know, they really did once they got on board. I'm not saying everybody participates, but we have enough participation that it makes it meaningful.
I think that's an important point. We're not here to, well, first of all, I don't know that we can make faculty, or to be honest, administrators do anything. But I think the important point here is you get people in the room. Some people will talk, some people won't, but you invite them to the meeting and you hope you facilitate a good discussion. And then eventually it becomes routine, right? And that's also going back to maybe some of the resistance. Maybe they don't believe in the assessment process. Maybe they don't trust the assessment process. We'll invite them to the meeting and have them talk about things and actually have some actions. You talked a little bit about compensation that the coordinators, they had the service requirement or something was in their position description. I've seen other institutions rewrite position descriptions to include gen ed assessment or some type of assessment. Is there any other type of compensation that you gave faculty for participating in assessment or overseeing an area?
Right, so the 4 coordinators actually get additional money. So they get the comparable of what a 1 hour. So they do get it's not a lot of money, but they do get a little bit of money to get to do that. It probably is important that assessment is part of the evaluation process, which it is for us, right? So faculty participating in assessment is part of the evaluation process. So that can help with your non-tenured and people who would like to be promoted. So we have that as a carrot, if you will. But like Tisha said, you're going to need to find those key faculty members who can be proponents of this. And there are some departments where there's a couple of faculty, they still have to collect the assessment data and they still have to turn it in, but they may not be involved. And then the other thing is when we have these, what we call roundtable discussions, we start out with some questions that we ask that have to do with what have you learned from your assessment data? And everybody's supposed to go around the room and talk about what they've learned about their assessment data. And then the second question is, and how have you used this assessment data to improve student learning? So when we have these conversations, we try to get people to articulate. Not everybody's going to have an answer, but we try to get at least one person from every department to articulate that. And I say we have it at least once every 3 years. We have had some departments that have had roundtables every year when we first started out because they were having difficulties. And so we were viewing this as, okay, so you're not collecting your data. So what can we do to help you collect your data? We're pretty much to the point now where we just do check in every 3 years, but if some department goes off the rail or some disciplinary category goes off the rail, then we do have a mechanism where we can get them all together and have a conversation.
Excellent, thank you. A couple of questions on a related topic. Is the data collected every time the course is taught, or do you have some sort of timeline, like you have 9 outcomes, or are they set on a time schedule, or is it every time the course is taught, there's data?
So prior to 2010, we were trying to do like you would collect your data if you were this one every 3 years, and then people would forget and they would lose their assessment. So now at this point, assessment data is collected every time the course is taught. For our large courses where we have lots of people in the courses, like college algebra or principles of communication, every student takes the assessment measure, whatever that is. And for math, it's like embedded into the final exam. So the student doesn't even know, right, that this question is going to be used for assessment. We do allow the departments to sample and then only report on a sample if they have a large number of artifacts. So they don't necessarily have to report on all of them, but all of the students must participate in the assessment. And again, a lot of them are embedded in final exams, so the students don't even know necessarily that this particular question is going to be a problem solving. But yeah, we discovered that if we let them have passes and you didn't have to do it this semester, maybe your faculty are more organized than ours, but then they would lose their assessments and they would forget about it. So we just pretty much say every semester you're going to assess. Now, if you only have 10 students, you really shouldn't be sampling, right? You can assess all 10 students, but if you have 400 students, then yeah, definitely let's do some sampling in terms of our reporting.
Excellent, thank you. Just a couple more here. Can you talk a little bit more about the Institutional Assessment Committee's peer review process? Give us some details about that.
So we have a committee of, I believe it's 26 members, and they actually review all of the academic programs, the non-academic, and the general education. Each person on the committee reviews 7 to 8 programs a year, and they work in pairs. So we always have 2 people do it. I am the one who assigns who's reviewing what, and when I do it, I always try to assign an experienced peer reviewer with somebody who's new and somebody who's looked at the program before with somebody who hasn't. And we have a form, and if anybody wants to see our form, it's just a PDF that the peer reviewers go through, and then they, you know, do we have outcomes? Do we have measures? Do we have findings? Are we talking about the strengths and weaknesses? You know, that's a big part. Do we have action plans? Do we have action items? We have these things called analysis questions where they need to reflect on what their assessment is. And so they pretty much go through each project, or in general education, it's so huge, we give them one outcome. So like one pair would do problem solving and another pair would do aesthetics. And then they give feedback to the program like, hey, you really didn't talk about your strengths and weaknesses, or here's another way to look at your data, or, you know, your data table was confusing. And so that's another way they get the feedback. They get that every year, regardless of whether they have a roundtable.
I have a question. I'm not sure. Somebody asked a question about norming sessions. For those areas, there's a question about how did you get everybody on board using the same measures for assessments, especially across departments. You noted that there was a rubric that everybody agreed on, and I think that is the way to go. That's the way I've seen some other institutions do it. First, how did you get everybody involved? And then the second question is, were there norming sessions? Because you and I could read the rubric very differently. So could you talk a little bit about that?
So I think the two chairs who started this in spring 2011 did a great job of including everybody. And I think that's why those 2 years of having everybody talk about the outcomes and then made people have a sense of ownership, right? And, you know, and so that had a lot to do with how we get involved. The General Education Committee did pass a policy, maybe in 2013 or 2014, that said, if you don't collect assessment data in 5 years, we're going to review whether you can stay in general education. Now, 5 years is a long time to go without collecting assessment data, but we've had a few courses, either because they weren't offered, which is a different issue than being offered and not collecting the assessment data. And the General Education Committee has kicked a couple courses out of Gen Ed for not collecting the assessment data. So if you don't collect assessment data for 5 years, they can either give you an extension or they can say, nope, you're not going to be general education. So I don't like to use that as a stick, but they do. And that's one way to get people to participate. Norming sessions and content validity and bias are actually things that we have been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. So we have an assessment plan for the whole university, and that's what was put on there. And so we have been working pretty much for the last 3 or 4 years on getting norming sessions and having people calculate their inter-rater reliability scores. And then if they're below 0.75, obviously we have some issues with how we're looking at the rubric, and we need to have those conversations. We don't have them do it on all the papers. We have them do it on a sample. I'm a mathematician, so I believe in random samples, but I tell them things like, you got to get the middle of the road papers because those are the hard ones, right? If it's a really bad paper, everybody will agree. If it's a really, if it's a great paper, everybody will agree. So, and we have been asking them to sit down and do that. And then you're right, it can be difficult across some of the disciplines because, you know, you may not necessarily have the expertise, but going back to economics, they're all teaching economics. One's from an ag point of view, one's from microeconomics, one's from personal finance, and one's from economic geography, but they all are economics. And so they are able to look at each other's problems and do some inter-rater reliability on the rubric there. And again, we don't ask them to do it on every artifact. We just want them to check in every once in a while. And so we've been actually in Weave, if you use Weave, there's a methodology session. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been really focusing on tell us about content validity if it's locally developed, and tell us about your inter-rater reliability if you're using a rubric. I will be honest and say we still have some pockets that are not doing inter-rater reliability in the norming session. And so again, when we have those roundtable discussions, that's when we come back to that and we have that conversation. And then I always offer to, you know, sit in a room, well, now it's by Zoom, sit in a Zoom room and, you know, help people with their inter-rater reliability and help them score and help them do. So, you know, my office can provide some support, but the faculty are the ones who really need to do it.
Excellent, thank you. Why don't you go ahead and go over your lessons learned? There's still some questions in the Q&A, but we can address those. You can address them either in the Q&A later or at the end when we have a few more minutes at the end of the session. But what were your lessons learned, Carla?
So I think I probably touched on these as I went on, but it takes you more time than you think to build consensus. So for us, it was 2 years. And we did have to have a lot of conversations about that. And people do want to be heard, and it's important that they're heard. And having faculty buy-in is key. And it is difficult sometimes to have faculty buy-in. I can't say that it didn't hurt that we got these things from HLC that said, hey, you need to do this, right? So that helped a little bit on the faculty. We had 2 great chairs who started this process out, who were very committed. They spent a lot of time. They did not receive any release time or any extra compensation, but they knew it was important. And so we have a 1-year chair and then a chair-elect on our general education committee. And so we had 2 great chairs who spent a lot of time, and that helped because the faculty listened to them and had their buy-in. And then the one thing that they struggled with that I was able to help them with a little bit was they wanted it to be perfect, right? And it's never going to be perfect, right? So at one point it was like, okay, we have to have our outcomes and we have to have it. It doesn't mean we can't make changes, right? So there's always room for improvement. And so, like I said, we started out with 8 outcomes and now we have 9. I think the wellness outcome has been rewritten a couple times because it wasn't really great the first couple times, but it gave us a place to start, and we have a process for rewriting it. And so you do just need to start. And then if your rubric isn't the best rubric in the world, okay, collect your data. You're going to have some iterative reliability problems. You're going to find that out when you do your norming sessions, and then let's revise the rubrics. And then, like I said, we've been really working on content validity and sending our rubrics out to external people to look at them. And we've gotten some really great feedback on our rubrics, and so they make changes. So, don't think that it's going to have to be perfect. You just need to get started and get that process going. So those are the main lessons that we learned.
I think that's a really good point to end on for your section, Carla, is that, and it's one of the things that I learned and probably you've learned in your time in the assessment field, assessment doesn't have to be perfect, but what's good enough to make decisions, right? We are not research, but we adhere to the tenets of research. So we do want reliability and validity. We don't have to have the perfect instrument. This is not going to a peer-reviewed journal. So what's good enough to make decisions? So I think that's an excellent point. There are some questions for you in the Q&A. You can either choose to answer them live or type your answer in the Q&A, but while I'm talking, so I'm going to switch over. It'll be actually Carla will either choose to type in her responses to your questions in the Q&A or answer them live. We'll have a few minutes at the end of this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about a plan to overcome some challenges. So Carla beautifully detailed her process at Cameron and was honest about it. It was hard. We had difficult conversations. And I want you to also remember a few things that she said. There was flexibility, but there were also key decisions that had to be made by faculty governance or leadership. And so I just want people to be clear on that yes, we honor academic freedom, and we honor faculty's purview of the classroom. And if you agree to teach a gen ed course, these are the outcomes that all of us as faculty and administrators have agreed, and it's our promise to the students. So one thing that I did want to iterate in that, and I thought that was a really good point that Carla came up with, that if you want to teach gen ed, then these are the decisions, these are the things that you have to do to teach a gen ed course. You can choose not to teach a gen ed course. So let's talk about a plan. Okay, so here is, and I put the URL in the chat. If you're going to use this document, please download it. Please do not type in the Google Doc. Please download it and save a copy to your computer. But I love to think about, and I bet Cameron did this, but maybe not as detailed. I love to think about who can I get to help me? Why would they help? What is their superpower? In other words, what can they do to help assess gen ed or move the assessment of gen ed forward? And then what is their role? That last column, where can they support the assessment of gen ed? So these are people, may or may not be real people, but you can see how this could go, and this could help your brainstorming session. So you have the assessment director. What is their superpower? Why would they be involved in gen ed assessment? Where can they support it? Let's move on to the middle, the 2 faculty members. One's an expert in pedagogy. One just really likes to help the institution. He's charismatic. What's their role? And Carla talked about these 2 chairs that did not get extra compensation, but moved this process forward. We all have them on our institution. Put them on your list. As you start to think about how to move your assessment of gen ed forward, these are the people that are going to be key. What I encourage you to do, though, is not involve them in all 3 or 4 years or the 2 years of developing student learning outcomes or the 3 years of trying to get the assessment data together. Involve them at key points. For instance, unless you're your assessment director, of course, your assessment director needs to be involved at all the points. But for instance, Jennifer Kidd, she's a faculty member. She's an expert in pedagogy and teaching and learning. She would be great once we got the assessment data to develop some faculty development for teaching in the gen ed or the core, for using the data for improvement, to work with faculty or departments on how to analyze their data and make improvements. She could also come in on the front end and do a norming session on the rubrics. So you only use her at key points in time. Maybe Orlando, your Orlando on your campus, this charismatic leader, maybe they come in and kick off the Gen Ed assessment committee and lead it for a couple years and then hand it off. Note here, I've also put the provost or the chief academic officer and faculty senate, the governance structure. Carla talked about this. Faculty senate, or faculty at least, made a policy, I think she said at some point, if you're not assessing, if you don't have assessment data, Gen Ed assessment data over 5 years, we've got to talk to you. At Old Dominion, the university I came from, our faculty governance said the same thing. You must participate in Gen Ed assessment. If you do not, we are happy to decertify you as a Gen Ed course. That came from faculty governance, not from Tisha, the administrator, even though Carla was faculty as well, not Carla, the assessment person, but faculty governance. So you need to be clear and you need to work with your faculty governance structure. So real quickly, before we get to some more questions, please keep them coming. I see Carla has typed in a lot of responses. Where are you going to start? And this process is long and hard. It's not going to be done in a year. And let me tell you, in my years of doing this and Carla's years of doing it, if it's done in a year, it's probably not done in a way that will be sustained. I just want to make that clear. If your accreditation visit is next year, do the best you can. But if you try to do all of this in 1 year, it probably will not be sustained after your accreditation visit is over. Start thinking about what's working and not working right now. If you currently have a Gen Ed assessment process, there might be some things that are working. There might be some things that are not working. Start there. Do you have to overhaul all of it, or can you overhaul components of it? Determine who needs to be part of that conversation, and that goes back to that plan in the previous slide. Who needs to be part of the conversation, and when do they need to be part of it? Carla talked about many times faculty were involved from the beginning. I took a little note here in my sticky. From the beginning, they were involved in focus groups and facilitated roundtables. They continue to facilitate roundtables. They were on the Gen Ed committee. They got feedback and input from faculty when developing the outcomes. And remember, the outcomes took a 2-year process. They also did some things in parallel. So while they were developing the outcomes, they talked to faculty about measures, about assignments, aligning with outcomes, those kinds of things. And then again, letting faculty know that they are welcome to be part of this Gen Ed assessment process. And to be part of it, these are the things that we need you to do. We need you to have we need you to use this rubric and be part of this area. Again, they can choose not to participate in Gen Ed. All of us do have those departments on campus that need the student credit hours, so it's amazing how quickly people will agree to using a similar rubric or the same rubric across different sections or courses. The other thing, and I hope this was, I hope you saw it in Carla's slides, but although she didn't say this directly, keep it simple and start small. Yes, you may say to me, now Tisha, redoing student learning outcomes is not small. I agree with you. They were in a unique situation. But once they got that ball rolling, then they worked on the measures and all of that. And again, this goes back to what's working and not working. Do you need to overhaul all of your outcomes, or can you tweak them annually or every 3 years? Can you revisit a few outcomes every few years? Do you need to revisit just the measures and maybe start getting people to use similar measures for assignments, something like that? So start small and keep it simple. You can build things over time. not every gen ed assessment outcome needs to be assessed every year. Carla has developed a mature process where now it just happens. The university I was at, 15 outcomes are assessed over 5 years. So it just depends on what you have and how much support you have to work with. I have been in the SAC-CRC region my entire career. I know Carla comes from HLC. I know some colleagues in Middle States. I am not aware of an accrediting body that's specialized or regional or institutional, now I think they call them, that requires outcomes to be assessed every single year. They need to be assessed on a timeline, and they need to be regularly assessed, but they do not need to be assessed annually. And then the last piece, don't give up. It does take time. It's a long process. 2 years to develop outcomes, 3 years to get some data. I know another institution that it took 4 years to figure it out. It takes some time, but where do you want to be in 3 to 5 years, and how do you start the path to get there? All right, so I saw Carla feverishly typing. Are there any questions, Carla, that you would like to answer live, or you would like to bring up for the good of the group?
So I have a couple. I know we're almost out of time, but there were some questions about whether our general education courses were first year or senior level courses, and how we would compare the data. So let me just answer a couple of those. There's a couple exceptions, but for the most part, all of our general education courses are 1,000 or 2,000 level courses. So they are pretty much entry level courses, except for Comp 1 and Comp 2, and making sure you have your prerequisites. You can take the courses in any order, right? So that does make it difficult. Somebody had asked, like, do you have growth a long time? We can do that in Comp 1 and Comp 2 for writing, but not necessarily for economics versus physical sciences, because they could take those courses in any order as long as they meet the math prerequisites. So they are mainly first year or senior level courses. Now, we have done some experiments with capstone level courses to collect some data there. They're not general education courses, but to look at the writing in capstone versus the writing in Comp 1 and Comp 2. And if anybody wants to ask me any questions about that, they can just send me an email at Kodi. Just a couple more on this one. Do we differentiate Gen Ed for the AAAS and baccalaureate degrees? No, because they have to all take the same general education courses. So those are all the same. We do differentiate among the Associate of Applied Science, because they only have to take 18 hours of general education. So that one is a little bit different. And then this is a great question. Have your improvements been primarily to do with the assessment process, or have they actually tied back to improving student learning, right? So that was one of the things HLC said to us, is like, you've got to change student learning. And we have worked really hard on that. And I have lots of examples now where I can show where a group of faculty have said, hey, they didn't learn this concept, right? This cohort did not learn this concept. So we're going to put a video in Blackboard, or we're going to have a different worksheet, or we're going to change the way we're going to approach this topic, or maybe we need to change the order of the topics. So yeah, I'm actually very proud of our faculty that we are actually now making changes to student learning. I will say at the beginning though, it does tend to be a lot about the process, right? Do you have your rubrics? Do you have your integrated reliability? Do you have that? But we have actually moved on to where we're actually getting changes in student learning. And so I think that's great for
and notice that took a few years. That took you a few years to get there. So again, you're not going to see it year 1, 2, or 3, 4 or 5 years out. You will see it. Just a quick reminder that there's a workshop coming up, Assessing Gen Education or Core. Don't call it Gen Ed. Some people don't like the term Gen Ed, but Core or General Education. There is a workshop coming in May, and you will see that information on the Weave Resources page. You can, again, get out your cell phone and scan that little QR code, and it'll take you to the Weave Resources page. If you don't know what the heck I'm talking about scanning a QR code, you can actually type in Weave Academy or Weave Knowledge Center in Google, and you'll be able to find it as well. I know there are a few questions left, and we can stay for a few minutes and answer those. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us for this last hour or so. I have learned something from Carla, and hopefully you have as well. And like Jordan said in the beginning, there will be a recording. So that will be sent out later to all those who registered. Thank you. And go ahead, Carla.
I would say, so if I can just stay on, I'll try to answer some of the questions that are in the chat. And then Fiona, if you want to send me an email about your AAS one, I'll try to answer that one. So I'm kodi@cameron.edu, and I can answer that one. So thank you so much. And these were great questions.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And again, thanks to Carla. And everybody have a wonderful day.